Well, here we are. It is 2023. I ended up reading 70 books in 2022, which is just exponentially more than I ever have in the past. I set my Goodreads goal to 50, and then about halfway through the year realized that I was going to blow right past that. So I increased it to 75, didn't make it to 75, but I'm very happy with 70. That is so many books. A few other non-bookish things that I enjoyed in 2022. 2022 did see the completion of a work that took me about a year to write for clarinet and saxophone, which then had its European premiere at the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, as well as a few other performances around Europe. I got some really wonderful feedback from composers that I admire greatly, so that was just huge. I did also immensely enjoy some movies and TV in the horror genre and outside the horror genre that were released in 2022. Ty West's triptych that started with X and then progressed to Pearl and will get its third installment, Maxine, very soon, was definitely a standout of the year, specifically Pearl. Pearl was fantastic. Just a complete 180 from X. A really beautiful, stylistically coherent, and emotionally resonant film. It's the first time I've really felt something from one of Ty West's films, apart from The Sacrament, although that was more just from my drawing connections to the actual tragedy that The Sacrament is based on. I won't spoil that if you've never seen The Sacrament. I do really recommend that film. Pearl also was very disturbing, a beautiful character study. Mia Goth, who I have been championing since A Cure for Wellness. It was really great seeing her lead a horror film with X and then just get an incredible vessel that I think should be Oscar nominated with Pearl. I also really loved the Hellraiser reimagining. That was one of my favorite films of the year. Alex Garland's Men, one I know a lot of people didn't get on with, but I absolutely loved. And of course, Jordan Peele's Nope, his third feature film and his third film that I have given 5 stars on Letterboxd. I will link my Letterboxd and the performance of my clarinet saxophone duo that I promised to link in a previous video and then forgot to do. I will link those below if you want to follow me on Letterboxd. I'm not very active on there right now. I haven't been watching as many movies as usual. Those are some of the horror films I really loved. I also wanted to mention the HBO series Avenue 5, which got its 2nd season. This is a sci-fi comedy from Armando Iannucci, the creator of Veep, which is my favorite TV show of all time. I love Avenue 5. I really want it to find an audience. You can blow through it very quickly, as I have done multiple times at this point. I love it to bits. So this is going to be a 2-part video. My sort of end of 2022 reading wrap-up / my favorite books that I read in 2022. So I know I had all these grand plans around Halloween for what I wanted to read for the rest of the year, and it completely imploded. I fell into a pretty big reading slump, but I'm kind of getting back on track now. There's going to be several components to this 2-part video. In this part is going to be my end of the year reading wrap-up, so just kind of going through everything that I read in the last couple months of 2022, and then my ranking of the new for 2022 horror books that I read. There were 10 books that were released in 2022 that I ended up reading. I figured with so many books and so many great books that I wanted to talk about in this wrap-up, it would be easier to just sort of split it into 2 different lists. So this one will be my top 10, even though it's just a ranking of the 10 that I read, releases from 2022. The next video will be my top 20 reads of 2022 that were backlist, not released that year. You get it. You know what I mean. You get it, Joaquin. Does anyone get that reference? Am I the only one? So that's going to be the second part of today's video. Let's get into the 2022 end of the year reading wrap-up from the composer next door. That's me. So first, and this is the book that I kind of blame for putting me in a reading slump, because I just wasn't prepared for how much of a difficult slog it was. The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. I didn't hate it, I wasn't mad at it. It was just sort of one of those things where I was like, wow, I didn't realize Henry James was this kind of writer. I do still love this story, and I find the dynamic between the governess, who is the protagonist, and Miles, the young boy that she's watching. It's a very disturbing dynamic, and has a lot of this really uncomfortable sexual undercurrent to it. That's sort of where the heart of the story is to me in terms of what makes it a horror story. I wish I could say I enjoyed it. I didn't. I found it quite a slog. It took me like 2 weeks to get through this very short thing, and my reading comprehension with it was not great. I'd really need to spend a lot of time going through this and looking up every word that I don't understand and really understanding this language to actually appreciate it. I then read a couple of short stories, one of which is actually a novella by H.P. Lovecraft. You can tell from the fact that I've never really talked about Lovecraft on my channel that I don't read much of him. We can't talk about Lovecraft without talking about his Olympic level racism, which is a problem for me when it shows up in his work, which was the case for The Shadow over Innsmouth, which was the first of the two stories I read. I did enjoy it overall. I do think the story is interesting, and the setting is incredibly atmospheric and evocative. He seems to have this fixation with the most horrifying thing a person can experience is finding out that their genetic makeup isn't exactly what they thought it was. And that is sort of a thematic through line in several of his works, and very much so in The Shadow over Innsmouth. I do respect the sandbox that he built with this whole Cthulhu mythos, but I like what other people have done with it more than him. So yeah, The Shadow over Innsmouth was not a great read for me, especially there's a chapter smack dab in the middle where it's entirely written in that dialect, where it's phonetically written out, which is something that I cannot stand, and it was a long chapter in this one and really unreadable. And the other one I read was The Haunter of the Dark, which I really loved, actually. The language wasn't as obnoxious as in The Shadow over Innsmouth, and it is actually genuinely pretty frightening. For me, it's more so that I like to read his work so that I can better understand that which came after it. Like Edward Lee's pastiches of Lovecraft. Here we have The Innswitch Horror and The Haunter of the Threshold. So that's why I read those two stories. This is a sequel slash parody slash just Edward Lee's own take on The Shadow over Innsmouth, and then this is his sequel to The Haunter of the Dark. Innswitch Horror is one of my favorite Edward Lee books that I've read so far. This has all of his idiosyncrasies as a writer, imputation factors quite heavily into it, as well as just bizarre sex, tentacles, and gross stuff, and cannibalism, and just so many wonderful things. I thought it was just perfectly paced. It does take its time to get going. It's kind of setting the stage. It does kind of suck Lovecraft's dick a little bit more than I'm personally comfortable with, especially towards the last act, but there is a hint of sort of tongue-in-cheek commentary on the kind of person Lovecraft was. It's very extreme and very gross and unsettling, which is what I love most about Edward Lee, so I really, really loved this one. And then The Haunter of the Threshold, which is way, way longer, and I didn't like it so much. It often does kind of end up on people's lists of their favorite Edward Lee novels and of the most extreme stuff he's written. And this is head and shoulders more extreme than any other Edward Lee I have read. You know, you would assume from this cover that there's a whole lot of supernatural insanity going on, and there isn't so much until the last quarter, which I loved. I really loved how everything came together at the end of this book. It did take its time getting there, and within that time, oh boy, was there quite a lot of rape. However, this is about a character who has rape fantasies and piss fetishes. She is a dirty, dirty girl. And I did find that a unique perspective from a protagonist, and very funny in some ways. The rape fantasy stuff is described in detail. There are pages and pages of just basically the most disgusting scatological stuff you could possibly think of, and it did start to feel a little bit like bad extreme horror authors who just sort of start writing a laundry list of the most disgusting things they can think of. I do think Edward Lee is better than that, so that's kind of why it was a little disappointing at some points. It is not all like that by any means, and especially when it gets into the more supernatural stuff, it's well written, it's fun to read, it's gross and fucked up in all the best ways. It's hard to quite pin down when it's good and when it's bad, at least for me personally, and this was kind of a mix. I do wish it was shorter. I do wish there was more supernatural insanity, and more, tentacles tearing people limb from limb. That's what this book sold me on, and there wasn't much of it, unfortunately. It was more just a dirty girl indulging in her dirty fantasies. So there was fun to be had, but not my favorite Edward Lee novel, I'm sorry to report. And then some more rapey debauchery with crossed family values. This is the second volume. I really did like the first volume of Crossed, but I thought it was a little bit tame compared to what I had been sold on what Crossed is, and how disturbing it supposedly is, how extreme. And this was what I kind of expected from the first volume, so I've seen people who really like the first volume really write this off as just tasteless. It is, I'd say, as artistic as the first volume, but it definitely does lean more heavily into just the shock and extreme stuff. Content warning ahead, this is very, very heavy. This particular volume is really heavy on incest and pedophilia. If you're like me and you kind of wanted to seek out Cross just to see how far it goes, this will probably give you more than the last one. It's by no means a great work of art, but I did enjoy it. I read it quickly, and it was really fucked up, which is what I want Crossed to be. And then one that did take me a while because it's so long was Salem's Lot by Stephen King, which I did end up really, really loving. It does take a while to get going. It wasn't really until part 2 that I started to see where the story was going, and really liked it. It's sort of a vampire story as a plague story. I think it's really well written. Stephen King tells a great story. It probably could have been cut down, especially in the opening chapters. There's a lot of just, okay, this is 100 pages of just letting us know what the people in the town are doing, but that does end up being important later on when they stop doing those things. And yeah, it does kind of have this melancholy tone to it that I really liked. I really enjoyed Salem's Lot, and my most recent read, The Beast House by Richard Lehman. Of course, I just mentioned this in my Richard Lehman unboxing that I was reading it, and I did finish it, and I loved it very much. I think this is a great starting point for Lehman. This is very tame in some ways compared to his other books. Specifically, I don't think there was one detailed sexual assault in this book, which, coming off the heels of Beware, was like a total 180 for me, because Beware is just like main characters getting assaulted multiple times per chapter in lots of detail. It was really unpleasant. That stuff is still there in The Beast House, but it doesn't have the pedophile character of the seller, so there's none of that, and nothing is described in detail as it's happening. The only completed assault, let's say, is not described in detail. We don't follow that character until after it's happened, and she doesn't actually remember it. There are a couple of attempted assaults that are thwarted, actually, which is a nice change of pace for Lehman. And those are described, more in the moment with more detail, but they never go too far. Like I said, they are thwarted. It is overall just a really enjoyable read. It's kind of like The Cellar in that there's not a whole lot happening in the Beast House. It takes a while for the characters to make their way there, but once it does, it's got a really page-turning, a much longer climax, much more satisfying encounters with the Beast in this book. So I thought it was better than The Cellar. I thought it was one of his more tasteful books, probably one of my favorites I've read from him so far. So now it's time for my top 10 2022 releases. Fairy Tale by Stephen King will not be on the list. I just got that as a Christmas present and I have not read it yet, but I love the cover so much, so I did want to display it in today's video. At number 10 is The Fervor by Alma Katsu. I liked this book as I was reading it, but my memory of it is pretty negative, mostly because of how bad the ending is. The more time between me and this book, the angrier I get about how it ended. I will be spoiling the ending now. I don't think The Fervor is a very good book. It's really not a satisfying read. This is a book about systemic oppression. It's about the Japanese internment camps and how the government took away the rights of Japanese people during World War II and just put them in concentration camps, basically. And it is all about, these characters having to deal with the government as a villain. And it ends with the FBI coming in and fixing everything and saying, well, there's a lot of these bad apples, but most people in power actually do want to help. And it's just completely the opposite of what we've learned. Alma Katsu did, I believe, used to work for the FBI or the CIA or something, so it doesn't surprise me that she does kind of come out with a more positive outlook towards government institutions. But as a reader who's just spent 200 pages learning about how terrible the American government was in the 40s, to have an ending that was just like, well, but some of them are okay, and that's all we really need. Just really bad ending, oh my god. So, there's my number 10. At number 9 is, unfortunately, The Babysitter Lives by Stephen Graham Jones. This was exclusively released as an audiobook, and I didn't really care for it. I still gave it an overall positive rating. Everything from here on out, I didn't hate it. These are all just sort of mixed bags for the next few. They're not books that I hate, and not even really books I dislike. I just had a really hard time getting into The Babysitter Lives. I did kind of find myself tuning out and then missing important things. That just kind of tells me that it wasn't the most engaging, and I was never really in the mood to listen to it. I think its strong suit is, of course, the character and the commentary on racism against Indigenous people. That tends to be a through line in all of his work, and he always does it very well. It's just kind of funhouse horror, which is not my type of thing. It is a haunted house story to some degree with a few extra little frills to it. So it's just maybe not my type of horror story. I'm still very much looking forward to Don't Fear the Reaper, which is coming out very, very soon. The sequel to My Heart is a Chainsaw, which I love. So yeah, unfortunately, this one was a bit of a miss for me. Coming in at number 8 is You've Lost a Lot of Blood by Eric LaRocca. I just don't really know what he was trying to do with this story. It is a fragmented narrative, and it does sort of have a story within a story format, but by the time I got to the end, I didn't really understand how it all connected. Or why, and I didn't really care. I don't mind having to connect the dots myself. There's many of my favorite books and movies are like that, where, stuff is left implicit and meanings can be drawn, but I have to care enough about the text in the first place to want to put in that extra work. And here I just didn't. It centers largely around a video game development, which is not something I'm terribly interested in, and the horror set pieces just didn't work for me. The best parts of it were the little scraps of information in between chapters, which is comparatively not very much of the book. So yeah, it was my first experience with Eric LaRocca, and not a great start, but it wasn't so bad that I never want to read another one of his books. Coming in at number 7 is one you may have expected to be lower, Sundial by Katrina Ward. This is a well done story. I don't dislike this book. I do love the cover. That's really the only reason I still have it, is that I can't bear to part with such a gorgeous artifact of a book. I do have the same issue with this that I do with The Last House on Needless Street, which is that it's not really a horror story, it's a thriller. But this is a much better book than The Last House on Needless Street. I did find it captivating. I did want to know what happened. It just sort of left me at the end like, oh, okay, well, there were some surprises in there, but it just felt like it never quite got there for me in terms of a horror story. I still think it's very well written. I like how the dual timeline is handled. As much as I don't consider myself a Katrina Ward fan based on the 2 books of hers that I've read, this is a good book. So coming in at number 6, right in the middle of the list where I definitely expected it to go, is Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin. This is a book I wanted to love. Some of it I did love. The characters are beautifully written and feel like they came from such a personal place. I annotated the shit out of it because I thought there was so much to say about transphobia, about TERFs, and how TERF ideology is so effective at recruiting people. It is a book that is full of untempered rage, and as a trans person myself, it is a rage that I do share. But this book just isn't for fence sitters. I'm not saying that Gretchen Felker Martin should just be nicer, because I don't care about nice, but I do think that this sort of brutal approach to the topic, it alienates people who are on the fence or uneducated about trans issues. So much of transphobia comes from a place of just not understanding. I do share the same hatred of transphobes and the same rage that is in this book, but I mean, even I found its presentation to be a little off-putting at times for just how unforgiving it is to people who have fallen prey to the TERF ideology. It's very, very slow. It's a character study. As brutal as the violence is when it's happening, there's a lot in between. There's a lot of like sex and transphobes being transphobic and trans people being trans. Which is, fine, but I don't know, maybe it's just that the post-apocalyptic format leads to these large sections of characters just sitting around waiting, because, it would be stupid to leave their shelter. There's much that I love and appreciate about this book. I do want to see a little bit more trans-centric fiction that educates people about trans issues in a bit of a patient way. It's very clear that that's not what Gretchen Felker Martin cares about. I'm a John Waters fan. I get angry queerness, and I love angry queerness. Tell me a good horror story too. Number 5 is Just Like Mother by Anne Heldsel. I listened to this one on audio, and yeah, it was really good. I don't think about it so much anymore, and I do recall the ending being a little rushed and a little unsatisfying. I really connected to the main character. It is very much like Rosemary's Baby in a lot of ways, but I had heard other people say that about it before I read it, and I still enjoyed it, and found myself wondering exactly what was going on here. I really liked Just Like Mother. It's not amazing by any means, but it is just a really good, solid read that I definitely recommend. Eric LaRocca had a pretty prolific year. Number 4 is We Can Never Leave This Place. This was so much better than You've Lost a Lot of Blood. I really got on with this. It feels like a more cohesive artistic vision. I feel like I get it. He does have some tendencies as a writer that do kind of bother me a little bit, that do feel a little bit amateurish, but the story is great, the symbolism is well incorporated, and it is very, very gross and gory. I really, really enjoyed this one. I've still got to read Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, but this one really was a win for me. I really did like it. Alright, baby, the top 3. So these are all books that I absolutely loved. The first of which is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. A really beautiful, slow burn, gothic ghost story drama with a really steamy forbidden love story in there. I was just so impressed that this was a debut novel. It just feels so polished and so confidently written. It is a bit slower. It did take me a little bit longer to get through, but I really enjoyed just sort of living in the mindset of this book. Those are some of the best books for me, are the ones where even when I put it down, I still sort of feel like I'm in that environment. It's a very, very atmospheric novel. Yeah, it's just so beautiful. I really loved this one. I think more people should check it out. If you're expecting Mexican Gothic again, this isn't that, and it does bother me a little bit that Mexican Gothic has been so central to the marketing of this book. They are very, very different books with very different goals, with very different styles. I wouldn't say that The Hacienda scared me, but it did move me, and I think it's a great book that you should definitely read. Number 2 is a book that I squeezed in right at the end of 2022, and why I didn't make this video till now, because I wanted to finish it. because I knew it would end up very, very high. Old Country by Matt and Harrison Query. So this started its life as a story on the No Sleep subreddit, and then became a novel, and also I believe has a Netflix deal. I would love to see this as a film. This is a really wonderful, unique, and chilling folk horror story. It follows a married couple in their 30s who buy this ranch at the base of the Teton Mountains and get some weird advice from their neighbors that turns out to be very important, because they are not alone in this valley, and their land most definitely does not belong to them. It's a really captivating story. It is a bit slower paced, but just the set pieces and just what the characters are going through is just so terrifying to imagine yourself in that situation. I did find myself really getting into the mindset of those characters. It made me feel uneasy. It's a fabulous, fabulous horror story. The characters are really well realized. The husband character bothered me so many times and infuriated me, and that's actually how you know that he's a well-drawn character. The book is clearly aware of the fact that he is kind of an infuriating person, but he's a realistically infuriating person. Really big surprise. I loved this book. Here we are at number 1, and I did not think that this would be my number 1, but it is. It's Such a Pretty Smile by Christy DeMeester. Yeah, it just worked for me in every possible way. The commentary is really well done. It's not overbearing. It's very clear what this book is trying to say without being preachy or obnoxious. It's not a creature feature. It is very much a psychological horror story. The setting of an abandoned amusement park. Roller coasters and theme parks are a niche interest of mine. I spend very much of my free time playing Planet Coaster and designing amusement parks, so that aspect of it certainly drew me to it. And the added knowledge that Jazzland was a real place that was actually washed out by Hurricane Katrina and still exists. It's just an abandoned theme park where the roller coasters are still standing and are overgrown. It's so strange and eerie, and that atmosphere is evoked so well in this book. I would love to see a film adaptation. Rosamund Pike was like who I pictured as the mother character in this, and I think she would do a fantastic job. I thought it was a fantastic horror story, a fantastic book. Number 5 through number 1 are all great books that I enjoyed very, very much, and this just ended up being the one I enjoyed the most. Alright, and that is it for the first part of my 2022 wrap-up. In the next video, we will go through my top 20 reads of 2022. None of these books will be on it. It is entirely backlist titles. Thank you for watching. I'm the composer next door, and have a fantastic 2023.